Yes, do. You only do because God allows it.
Who possess the soul of the Pope?
My faith.
The Pope's Exorcist, 2023 Analyses and Explanations. The film, released in 2023 and directed by Julius Avery, is a supernatural horror story inspired by the real-life figure of Father Gabriele Amorth, but it quickly reveals itself as a genre hybrid, blending theological dread with action-adventure sensibilities. This analysis dissects its every element, from its relationship with the memoirs of the real Amorth to the implications of its ending. The movie presents itself as a biographical account of a holy man, yet from its opening moments, it establishes a tone that is less a solemn prayer and more a rollicking, supernatural adventure. This is a film that asks the audience to accept Russell Crowe on a Vespa as the Vatican's chief exorcist, a narrative choice that signals its intentions with a wink and a grin. Russell Crowe does not merely perform the role of Father Amorth. He attacks it with the gruff charisma of a man who has decided that an inconsistent Italian accent is a feature, not a bug. His performance is the gravitational center around which all the absurdities and theological musings safely orbit. The narrative architecture is built upon a foundation of trauma and grief. The story transports us to a desolate Spanish abbey inherited by Julia, a recently widowed American mother. This setting is not merely a backdrop for demonic activity. It is a physical manifestation of a fractured family's psyche. The crumbling stone and dark corridors mirror the internal state of Henry, her young son, who is drowning in survivor's guilt following his father's fatal car accident. The malevolent force here is not a nameless ghoul, but Asmodeus, a prince of hell borrowed from the apocryphal book of Tobit. This specific choice links the modern psychological breakdown of a family to a malevolent intelligence that has been perfecting its craft for millennia. Father Amorth arrives not in a black car of somber purpose, but on a Lambretta scooter, weaving through Roman traffic with a smirk. This image is a thesis statement. The sacred and the profane will coexist here, not as philosophical opposites, but as rowdy bedfellows. The film immediately undercuts the stereotype of the haunted, trembling priest, replacing him with a pragmatist who treats battling the original evil as a taxing but familiar job. Father Thomas, the young and devout apprentice, functions as a foil to Amorth's weathered cynicism. Their dynamic is a theological debate personified. Thomas represents orthodox, book-bound faith that can curdle into fear, whereas Amorth embodies a faith so battle-hardened it has learned to laugh at the darkness to rob it of its power. The initial possession scenes deploy the classic horror toolkit: a child speaking in guttural, blasphemous tongues, objects moving of their own accord, and impossible physical contortions. However, these tropes are delivered with such technical proficiency and Crowe's dismissive reactions that they feel less like terror and more like a theatrical welcome party for the arriving exorcist. The demon is performing, and Amorth is a harsh critic. At the midpoint, the narrative abandons its monster-in-the-room horror in favor of a conspiracy thriller. Amorth discovers a secret chamber beneath the abbey containing a mummified corpse and a confessional booth sealed for centuries. This is where the true thematic interest crystallizes, pivoting from saving one boy to unearthing a systemic, historical cancer within the church itself. The skeleton belongs to a priest who was not just a fanatic, but was himself possessed by Asmodeus during the Spanish Inquisition. The demon reveals it used a man of God to twist the machinery of the church, torturing and killing innocents not in the name of Christ, but as fuel for diabolical chaos. The film thus argues that the greatest demonic victory is to make the sacred indistinguishable from the monstrous. Asmodeus does not simply want Henry's body. He wants to weaponize Amorth's guilt to corrupt his soul. The demon's power is forensic, a dark psychoanalysis that uses the exorcist's past failure as ammunition. This shifts the battleground from the possessed child's body to Amorth's own conscience, making the exorcism a form of shared therapy. Years earlier, Amorth dismissed a young woman named Rosaria as mentally ill rather than spiritually afflicted, a fatal misdiagnosis that ended in her suicide. This memory is the demon's greatest weapon. The film uses it to explore the perilous boundary between psychology and faith, suggesting that arrogance in either field leaves a vacuum for evil to fill. For much of the runtime, the devil's presence is suggested through flesh. Henry's body is twisted into a perverse sculpture, his skin stretched and his joints inverted. This practical body horror approach is far more effective than the later CGI spectacle. It roots the supernatural horror in a physical reality that is deeply unsettling, making the human form feel like a fragile shell ready to be broken from the inside. The abbey itself is a living entity. The production design makes the ancient structure a repository of secrets. The walls are not silent. They hide occult symbols and hidden passages. Once a house of God, it was built upon a dungeon of torture. This physical layering is a metaphor for the church itself, a holy facade potentially cloaking a corrupted foundation, a place where sacred consecration battles with buried atrocity. In a moment of theatrical revelation during the third act, the demon informs Amorth that this personal battle is just one theater in a global war. There are 199 other possessed sites, all known and catalogued by a secretive Vatican inner circle. This single line of dialogue retroactively transforms the entire film from a standalone exorcism story into the origin myth for a supernatural globe-trotting franchise. The Vatican is portrayed not as an unblemished bastion of light, but as a deeply flawed, bureaucratic entity that has prioritized the containment of evil over its eradication. This is a radically cynical take on a religious institution, suggesting that the real sin is the cover-up. The film posits that the devil's greatest earthly success has been convincing the church to hide his existence to avoid a scandal. The climax abandons theological subtlety for action hero spectacle. Father Amorth, having been physically demolished by the demon, does not win through a prolonged ritual alone. He rides a possessed motorcycle down a cathedral aisle. This scene is a litmus test for audiences. Critics see a jarring descent into silliness, while fans see a glorious embrace of chaos. The motorcycle sequence links the film to a tradition of pulp adventure. It is a visual assertion that Amorth is not just a priest but a warrior whose faith is so robust it can commandeer and repurpose even a demonically animated machine. This repositions the character from a cleric performing a rite to a supernatural action hero, a spiritual Indiana Jones hunting relics and banishing demons with equal flair. Amorth's use of the rosary is profoundly symbolic. He wraps the beads around the possessed child's neck, using them to physically subdue him. This represents a faith that is not passive but physically interventionist, one that binds evil in a literal knot of holy violence. At the climax, a profound theological concept becomes a physical act. Amorth, facing defeat, offers his own soul in exchange for the boy's. This is the principle of substitutionary atonement, a direct imitation of Christ's sacrifice. He willingly damns himself to save an innocent. It is not a holy word in Latin that breaks the demon, but a holy action of total, self-negating love. In his moment of deepest peril, as he offers his soul to the abyss, Amorth is rescued not by a swarm of angels, but by a vision of the Madonna. She intercedes. This is a deeply Catholic resolution, bypassing the Trinity to focus on the power of Marian intercession. The film suggests that at the darkest moment of patriarchal institutional failure, a female divine presence is the ultimate source of salvific grace. Henry's liberation comes not because a spell was correctly recited, but because his core wound, his guilt over his father's death, was addressed and absorbed by a greater act of sacrifice. The psychological and spiritual are explicitly shown to be one. The demonic hold was a supernatural parasite on a natural, human wound, and healing the wound starved the spirit. The literal plot resolves, but the film closes not with peace but with a new mission. Amorth and Thomas are shown a map in the Vatican archives, a star chart of evil. This ending reframes the entire narrative as a prologue, transforming Amorth from a local exorcist into a general in a secret, cosmic war that the Church has been too afraid to fight publicly. The post-credits scene is perhaps the most crucial piece for understanding the film's intent. It depicts Amorth on an airplane, heading to his next mission with his apprentice. He orders a drink with a wink. The scene is a James Bond or mission, impossible setup in clerical garb. This cements the film's identity. It is building a shared universe where holy men are action operatives. The historical Father Gabriele Amorth performed over 60,000 exorcisms, wrote best-selling memoirs, and was a controversial, media-savvy figure. The film is inspired by his life, but the source material is a collection of sober theological reflections. The adaptation instead extracts Amorth's personality, his bluntness, his unexpected humor, his self-assurance, and drops him into a fictitious Dan Brown conspiracy. The real Amorth often joked about the devil, not out of disrespect, but from a position of absolute confidence in Christ's victory. Crowe's sardonic delivery captures this authentic theological swagger. However, the historical Amorth never uncovered a centuries-old cover-up. That element is pure Hollywood invention, a device to give a man of prayer the stakes of an action hero. The International Association of Exorcists condemned the film upon release, calling it unreliable splatter cinema contrary to historical reality. Their objection was not merely about sensationalism, but about the depiction of the Vatican as complicit in evil. The film creates doubt as to who the real enemy is, the devil or ecclesiastical power. This institutional rejection is significant because it comes from the very people whose work the film purports to portray. The film engages seriously with the debate between psychology and spirituality. Amorth's greatest failure came when he prioritized psychiatric diagnosis over spiritual discernment. Yet the film does not dismiss science entirely. Instead, it argues for a both-and approach, where the supernatural realm is real and requires its own form of expertise alongside medical knowledge. Beneath the schlocky surface, genuinely interesting theological ideas exist, though they are often buried under action sequences. The film explicitly critiques dualistic thinking, the idea that good and evil are equal opposing forces. Amorth's worldview centers on Christ rather than on Satan. Evil exists not as God's opposite, but as the absence of God, a corruption of free will. The demon Asmodeus is depicted as an ancient intelligence that exploits trauma and institutional decay. This aligns with traditional Catholic teaching. The devil can only enter where he is invited, whether through deliberate sin or through unhealed wounds. Exorcism is therefore not just about expulsion, but about healing the underlying vulnerability. The film's most daring thematic move is its critique of the Church as an institution. The Vatican has known for centuries about the demonic sites, but chose secrecy over action. The sins of the Inquisition were not just the sins of individual possessed priests. They were the sins of an institution that prioritized its reputation over truth. Yet the film ultimately resolves this tension by separating the flawed institution from the purity of Amorth's individual faith. Henry's guilt over surviving the car accident that killed his father makes him a perfect victim for possession. The demon does not overpower him through sheer strength. It seduces him through his pain. This portrayal makes the theological point that evil is not a blunt instrument, but a cunning predator that stalks the vulnerable. Julia, the grieving widow and mother, represents a secular world utterly unprepared for supernatural evil. Her arc moves from skepticism to desperate belief. Her journey reflects the film's broader argument that a purely materialist worldview leaves people defenseless against realities they refuse to acknowledge. The production budget of roughly $18 million is modest for a studio horror film, and this is visible on screen. The early practical effects are genuinely effective, but as the film progresses into its third act, the CGI becomes noticeably rougher. The demons' physical manifestations look like they belong in a lower-budget production. This inconsistency reveals the financial limitations that shaped the film's creative choices. The film grossed approximately $77 million worldwide against its modest budget, making it a solid commercial success. The sharp divide between a low critic score and a high audience score on aggregate sites reveals a film that knows exactly what it wants to be, even if professional reviewers wished for something more sophisticated. Russell Crowe earned a Golden Raspberry Award nomination for his performance, a dubious honor he did not win. This nomination says more about the cultural discomfort with a film that refuses to take itself seriously than it does about the quality of his acting. Crowe is genuinely compelling, bringing physicality and charm to every scene. The film has gained additional popularity on streaming platforms, frequently appearing in top 10 lists. This suggests it may achieve cult status, a work dismissed by critics but embraced by genre fans looking for undemanding supernatural entertainment. One disturbing element is based on a real unsolved mystery. The film includes a flashback where a possessed girl is abused by a priest who claims to be performing an exorcism. This references the 1983 disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi, a 15-year-old Vatican City citizen whose case remains unsolved. Critics have called this inclusion exploitative, using real tragedy for thematic weight without meaningful engagement. The film ends with Amorth reporting to the Pope, played by Franco Nero. Nero's casting is itself a cinematic in-joke, as he has played everything from Lancelot to Django. His brief appearance as a shaken pontiff adds a gravitas that the final scenes need, grounding the conspiracy in recognizable ecclesiastical authority. The score blends traditional choral elements with modern action rhythms, reflecting the film's dual identity. Gregorian chants swell as demons are punched. This musical strategy tells the audience to expect neither a pure prayer nor a pure blockbuster, but a deliberate fusion of both modes. The demon's voice, rendered with layered guttural effects, is another technical success. It speaks not as a mindless monster, but as a calculating intelligence. Its dialogue is full of theological mockery and intimate psychological insight, making it a more compelling villain than a simple roaring beast. The film draws clear visual inspiration from William Friedkin's 1973 classic The Exorcist, from the contorted bodies to the use of Latin ritual. But where Friedkin's film is a slow-burn meditation on doubt and faith, this one is a roller coaster. The homage is superficial, a borrowed aesthetic rather than a shared spiritual inquiry. Father Thomas undergoes his own arc from terrified orthodoxy to courageous faith. His character demonstrates that the film values action over passive belief. He learns that battling evil requires not just correct doctrine, but the willingness to get physically and spiritually dirty. The use of the confessional as a narrative device is pointed. The hidden confessional beneath the abbey contains centuries of unspoken sins. Exorcism in this film is framed as an extreme form of confession, a brutal extraction of truths that have festered in darkness. The demon's power is secrecy. The exorcist's weapon is revelation. The Spanish Inquisition backdrop provides historical weight. By connecting modern demonic activity to one of the Church's darkest chapters, the film suggests that institutional sins have generational consequences. Evil buried does not die, it waits. The abbey is not haunted by a ghost, but by the covered-up crimes of the faithful. The concept of the possessed pig is a strange but effective set piece. Amorth shoots the animal without hesitation, a moment that signals his ruthless pragmatism. The demon uses any vessel available, and sentimentality about innocent creatures is a luxury the exorcist cannot afford. This moment is shocking precisely because it breaks the expected reverence for life. The chemistry between Crowe and Zavato as Father Thomas carries the film's quieter moments. Their banter, while sometimes forced, provides the human connection that the horror elements need. The apprentice's wide-eyed fear and the master's weary deadpan create a rhythm that sustains audience engagement between set pieces. The physical toll of exorcism on the practitioner is a recurring visual motif. Amorth is beaten, bloodied, and exhausted by the film's end. The message is clear. Fighting evil costs the fighter everything. This is not a sanitized spiritual battle. It is a brutal, embodied struggle that leaves visible marks. The film's marketing leaned heavily on Crowe's star power, and understandably so. He is in nearly every frame, and the film would collapse without his anchoring presence. His willingness to commit fully to the material, no matter how absurd, gives the audience permission to enjoy the ride without guilt. The 199 possessed sites reveal functions as a narrative sequel hook, but it also serves a thematic purpose. It transforms evil from a localized anomaly into a global, organized threat. The church is not fighting isolated incidents, but a coordinated campaign. This raises the stakes from a single family's salvation to the fate of the world. The demon's claim to know church secrets is never fully resolved. The film leaves ambiguous whether the Vatican's secrecy is malevolent conspiracy or frightened self-preservation. This ambiguity is more interesting than a clear answer, forcing the audience to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that institutions built on truth might be built on lies. The film ultimately argues for a faith that is active, embodied, and willing to confront institutional failure. Amorth is not a blind loyalist. He is a reformer who loves the church enough to expose its sins. This makes him a distinctly modern hero, a man of tradition who is nevertheless at war with the traditionalists who would hide the truth. The aesthetic draws from a rich tradition of Italian horror and Gothic literature. The abbey, the ancient texts, the hidden chambers, and the grotesque bodily transformations all echo the works of directors like Dario Argento and Mario Bava. The film functions as a love letter to Italian genre cinema, filtered through a mainstream Hollywood sensibility. The demon's defeat through self-sacrificial love is theologically orthodox but cinematically rushed. The emotional weight of Amorth offering his soul lands softly because the film has spent more time on action and conspiracy than on building the spiritual stakes. The idea is powerful, but the execution is undermined by the need to reach the next explosion. The film leaves Father Thomas positioned as Amorth's permanent partner, a dynamic that promises sequels built on the buddy cop formula in Cassix. This structure is proven in action cinema, and translating it to Exorcism is the film's most commercially savvy move. The line, "Our sins will seek us out," is spoken by Amorth and functions as the film's moral thesis. The demon does not invade randomly. It follows the scent of guilt and despair. Redemption therefore requires confronting those sins, not hiding from them. The exorcism is a forced reckoning. The special effects team prioritized the transformation of the human body over the creation of a fully realized demonic creature. This is a wise allocation of limited resources. A contorted human face is more unsettling than a digital monster, because it suggests that the demon is not an external invader, but a corruption of what is already inside us. The film's brisk pace means that character development is often sacrificed for momentum. Julia's grief, Henry's guilt, and even Amorth's past failure are sketched rather than deeply explored. The film trusts its actors to fill in the emotional gaps with performance rather than dialogue, a strategy that works more often than it fails. The climax's reliance on Amorth's personal sacrifice rather than ritual formula suggests that the power of exorcism lies not in the words, but in the disposition of the heart. This is a surprisingly Protestant inflection in a deeply Catholic film, emphasizing personal relationship and sacrificial love over sacramental mechanics. The film's final image of Amorth on the plain, a fighter between battles, completes his arc from haunted failure to resolute warrior. He has not forgotten Rosaria, but he has integrated that loss into a larger mission. He is no longer paralyzed by guilt, but mobilized by it, a wounded healer traveling the world to fight the wounds he cannot see. This is a film of contradictions. A great actor doing committed work in a mediocre film, serious theological themes buried beneath silly action sequences, a desire to honor a real priest while inventing a fictional conspiracy he would have condemned. And yet it works not as horror or as theology, but as entertainment. Russell Crowe rides a Vespa, says Latin prayers while fighting CGI demons, and delivers one-liners that make possessed children scowl. This is not high art. It is not even particularly good horror. But it is fun, a quality increasingly rare in franchise filmmaking. Its legacy will likely be as a cult favorite, the Exorcism movie audiences put on when they want supernatural thrills without the psychological weight. The geographical and temporal setting of 1987 Spain serves multiple narrative functions beyond mere historical backdrop. The year places the story firmly in an era before instant communication, before the internet, when secrets could still be buried in stone and silence. This temporal distance from the present day creates a buffer zone where myth and history can comfortably blur, where a demonic conspiracy feels more plausible because the mechanisms of exposure did not yet exist. The choice of Spain, specifically a ruined abbey in the countryside, taps into a deep cultural memory of the Inquisition, of Catholicism's most brutal chapter. The location is not neutral. It is a scar on the body of Christendom. By excavating this scar, the narrative insists that the past is never truly past, that the blood of the innocent soaks into the ground and cries out for acknowledgement. Russell Crowe's physical transformation for the role deserves extended consideration, as it departs significantly from the gaunt, haunted exorcists of cinematic tradition. Crowe's Amorth is stout, broad-shouldered, a man whose physical presence suggests a former rugby player more than a cloistered academic. This deliberate physicality communicates volumes about the film's conception of spiritual warfare. The battle against darkness is not an ethereal contest of pure minds. It is a brawl, a wrestling match that demands muscle and mass. When the demon hurls Amorth across a room, the impact registers because Crowe's body has real weight. His bulk becomes a visual metaphor for a faith that is incarnational, not abstract. This priest does not float through the world. He occupies space forcefully, pushing back against invisible forces with visible determination. The film's approach to the mechanics of possession reveals a sophisticated understanding of how evil operates as a predator of vulnerability. Henry is not chosen at random. He is groomed through a sequence of psychological fractures that began long before his family arrived at the Abbey. His father's death in a car accident that Henry survived created a fissure of guilt so deep it became a doorway. The demonic strategy is patient, methodical, almost clinical. This portrayal aligns with the film's underlying theological realism, contradicting the popular notion that demons attack indiscriminately. Instead, the narrative demonstrates that possession is the final stage of a long process of spiritual erosion, where unhealed wounds, unconfessed shame, and isolation create the conditions for invasion. The demon does not break down the door. It waits until the door is left unlocked by grief. The symbolic architecture of the abbey itself functions as a character within the ensemble, a silent witness to centuries of sanctity and atrocity. Every corridor, every collapsed archway, every faded fresco tells a story of decline and concealment. The production design creates a vertical hierarchy of spiritual significance. The chapel at the highest point, the living quarters in the middle, and the hidden torture chambers in the depths below. This vertical arrangement is a theological map. Heaven above, the mundane human world in between, and hell literally below the surface. The descent into the catacombs is a descent into the repressed memory of the Church, a journey into the institutional unconscious where the ugliest truths have been locked away. The architecture insists that to understand the present demonic attack, one must first excavate the buried past. The voice of Asmodeus, crafted through multiple layers of audio processing and a performance that modulates between seductive whisper and guttural roar, represents a demonology of sound. The voice is the demon's primary weapon, and the film treats it as such. It does not merely communicate. It manipulates, seduces, accuses, and dismantles. The sound design places this voice everywhere and nowhere, coming from the boy's mouth but also from the walls, the air, the listener's own skull. This sonic omnipresence creates a claustrophobic terror that visual effects alone cannot achieve. The demon is in the atmosphere, an auditory infection that colonizes space and mind simultaneously. The Exorcism, then, is also a battle for control of the soundscape, a war of words between Latin prayers and diabolical counterspeech. The dynamic between Amorth and the local Spanish clergy introduces a subtle but significant critique of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The priest who initially requests Vatican assistance is portrayed as well-meaning but utterly unequipped, a man whose seminary training provided no preparation for genuine supernatural confrontation. His relief at Amortha's arrival is tinged with a shame that speaks to the institutional neglect of exorcism as a pastoral discipline. The film quietly argues that the Church has systematically de-skilled its clergy in matters of spiritual warfare, preferring a rationalistic, psychological framework that protects its modern credibility. This institutional preference leaves local priests abandoned when faced with realities their education denied. Amortha's role is therefore not just that of an exorcist, but of a corrective to decades of institutional malpractice. The subplot involving Amy, Henry's teenage sister, provides a necessary counterpoint to the possession narrative by demonstrating a different form of vulnerability. She is not possessed but is terrorized, isolated, and manipulated by the demon's ability to weaponize her family's secrets. Her resistance, though less theologically spectacular than Henry's ordeal, is arguably more heroic in its human dimension. She fights without rituals, without holy water, armed only with loyalty and a refusal to abandon her brother. Her character arc moves from teenage detachment to fierce, protective agency. In a film dominated by clerical males and masculine demons, Amy's presence serves as a reminder that spiritual warfare encompasses the ordinary faithful, not just ordained specialists, and that courage is not conferred by ordination. The concept of the demonic confessional, discovered sealed beneath the abbey, is one of the film's most inventive and disturbing creations. For centuries, this wooden box has held the secrets of a possessed inquisitor, a perversion of the sacrament of reconciliation. Where the confessional normally serves as a site of forgiveness and liberation, this one functioned as a trap, a place where evil confessed was never absolved but instead accumulated and festered. When Amorth opens it, he unleashes not just information but a concentrated residue of historical sin. The scene operates as a darkened version of sacramental theology. Confession without a valid priest, sin without absolution, secrecy without redemption. The demonic confessional is a monument to the Church's failure to deal honestly with its own corruption. The film's treatment of the Rosary transcends mere prop status to become a multi-layered symbol of Catholic identity and spiritual weaponry. In Amorth's hands, the beads are simultaneously a prayer tool, a physical restraint, a focus for meditation, and a visible sign of papal authority. The film does not explain these layers. It simply trusts that audiences will absorb them through Crowe's tactile, almost aggressive handling of the object. He grips the rosary like a soldier grips a knife, yet the object itself is clearly fragile, a string of wooden beads that should break under tension. Its power lies not in material strength, but in what it represents, a chain of prayers linking the user to Mary, to the communion of saints, to the entire mystical body of Christ. The rosary is a network, and the demon is isolation. The network wins. The performance of Peter de Souza Faiani as the possessed Henry demands analysis for its physical extremity and its emotional precision. Child possession performances risk either laughable excess or unsettling credibility, and this one lands firmly in the latter category. The contortions are genuinely disturbing, achieved through a combination of the young actor's flexibility and digital enhancement that never fully obscures the human form beneath. More impressive are the moments of stillness, when Henry's face shifts from innocent fear to ancient malice without apparent transition. The demon's personality emerges not just through the voice but through micro-expressions, a smirk that does not belong to a child, eyes that calculate rather than react. This layered performance makes the possession feel like a genuine occupation rather than a simple impersonation. The film's integration of the Book of Tobit as source material for its demonic antagonist represents a deliberate theological choice with narrative consequences. The biblical Asmodeus is a demon of lust who kills 7 bridegrooms before they can consummate their marriages, making him fundamentally an enemy of love, family, and continuity. By choosing this specific demon rather than a generic devil, the screenplay connects Henry's family trauma to a larger mythological war against human flourishing. Asmodeus hates families because families are icons of divine community. His attack on Henry is not random predation. It is strategic action within a cosmic campaign to destroy the bonds that hold creation together. This specificity enriches the theological texture of what could have been a generic possession narrative. The moment when Amorth confronts his own reflection in the demon's knowledge is a turning point that redefines the exorcism's stakes. Until this scene, the exorcist has maintained professional detachment, treating the demon as a problem to be solved through ritual expertise. But when Asmodeus begins to speak Rosaria's name with intimate, mocking precision, the professional mask cracks. The demon reveals that it knows not just facts but feelings, not just events but the exorcist's interpretation of those events. This is a violation deeper than physical assault. The demon invades Amorth's memory and rewrites his self-understanding, transforming him from a competent practitioner into a guilty failure. The exorcism becomes a mutual exposure, each combatant laying bare the other's wounds. The film's color palette deserves analytical attention for its gradual progression from warm Mediterranean tones to a cold, desaturated horror aesthetic. The opening scenes in Rome are bathed in golden light, terracotta, and blue sky, establishing a world of sensory richness and divine beauty. As the narrative moves to the Spanish Abbey and descends into its depths, color drains away, replaced by grays, deep browns, and the occasional sickly green of decay. This chromatic journey externalizes the spiritual movement from grace to desolation. When the climax arrives in the underground chamber, the near-monochromatic darkness suggests a world from which divine light has been almost entirely withdrawn. The final restoration of color after Henry's liberation is not just a visual release, but a theological assertion that salvation is chromatic. The film's engagement with the real Father Amorth's controversial statements about cultural phenomena creates an uncomfortable but productive tension. The historical Amorth famously warned against yoga, Harry Potter, and heavy metal music as potential gateways to demonic influence. The film wisely avoids reproducing these specific claims, which would alienate contemporary audiences, while preserving the underlying principle that seemingly harmless cultural practices can, in certain contexts, open spiritual vulnerabilities. This delicate navigation between authenticity and accessibility reveals the screenwriter's awareness that Amorth's actual views were more extreme than a mainstream Hollywood film could accommodate. The result is a sanitized Amorth whose theological edges have been smoothed into marketable shape. The characterization of the demon as a liar who tells the truth represents one of the film's most theologically sophisticated moves. Asmodeus does not simply deceive. It weaponizes facts, deploying accurate information in the service of despair. When it reveals the Vatican conspiracy, it is telling the truth, but the truth is presented in such a way as to destroy faith rather than purify it. This is a demonic strategy far more dangerous than simple lies. Lies can be exposed and dismissed. Truth weaponized into hopelessness is far harder to resist. Amorth's victory requires him not to refute the demon's facts, but to recontextualize them within a larger narrative of redemption. The church may be corrupt, but that corruption does not invalidate the faith it professes. The physical geography of the final confrontation stages a battle across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. The visible action involves Amorth, Henry, and Father Thomas in a stone chamber, but the dialogue makes clear that the real combat is occurring on a spiritual plane inaccessible to cameras. The film attempts to visualize this invisible war through wind, shadow, fleeting forms, and the physical reactions of the actors to forces unseen. This approach is necessarily incomplete, and its partial success highlights the fundamental challenge of filming spiritual warfare. How does one depict a battle that by definition transcends the visual? The film's answer is to suggest rather than show, to let the actors' bodies register impacts from invisible sources, trusting the audience to complete the picture imaginatively. The institutional memory of the Church as depicted in the film is not a source of wisdom, but of pathology. The Vatican's archive of possessed sites represents knowledge preserved not for action, but for avoidance, a map of problems deliberately unaddressed for centuries. This portrayal challenges the traditional Catholic self-understanding of the Church as a hospital for sinners. Here, the institution functions more like a quarantine facility, isolating outbreaks rather than curing them. Amorth's discovery of this archive positions him as a whistleblower within his own hierarchy, a loyal son who must disobey his mother to save her. This internal conflict between institutional loyalty and prophetic witness is one of the oldest tensions in Christian history, here rendered as action-adventure. The film's sound design during the exorcism sequences creates a layered acoustic environment where Latin prayers, demonic counterspeech, ambient dread, and sudden silence all function as elements in a spiritual soundscape. The Latin is not translated for the audience, preserving its liturgical mystery and emphasizing that the power of the rite lies not in comprehension, but in authority. The demon's responses, by contrast, are in the vernacular, clear, and personal, designed for maximum psychological penetration. This linguistic asymmetry maps onto a theological distinction. Divine power operates through sacred mystery, while demonic power operates through intimate psychological manipulation. The exorcist speaks a language the demon must obey. The demon speaks a language the exorcist cannot ignore. Russell Crowe's accent choice has been a subject of much critical commentary, but it merits analysis as a performance strategy rather than a flaw. The accent is not consistent, shifting between Italian inflections, Crowe's native Australian vowels, and a vaguely British theatricality. Rather than reading this as failure, one might understand it as characterization. Amorth is a man who moves between worlds, comfortable in Vatican halls and rural villages, in Latin liturgy and colloquial banter. His voice, like his identity, is hybrid, unsettled, post-national. The accent shifts register depending on audience and context, suggesting a man who has learned to code switch for survival in a global institution. This reading may be generous, but it aligns with the character's depicted adaptability. The visual representation of Marian intercession at the climax deserves analysis for its restraint in an otherwise maximalist film. The Virgin Mary appears not as a fully realized character, but as a luminous presence, a figure of light and maternal compassion that communicates without dialogue. The choice to present Mary as a visual rather than verbal presence aligns with traditional Catholic iconography, where she often appears as a silent intercessor, her power residing in her relationship to Christ rather than in independent speech. This moment of quiet, feminine, maternal rescue provides a counterbalance to the film's otherwise masculine, violent mode of spiritual combat. Salvation comes not through the warrior, but through the mother. The film's treatment of doubt distinguishes it from more simplistic religious cinema that presents faith as the absence of questioning. Amorth doubts constantly. He doubts the system, he doubts his own competence, he even doubts the efficacy of the rites at certain moments. But his doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is faith's constant companion, the friction that keeps belief honest. The demon attempts to weaponize doubt, to push it from creative tension into destructive despair. Amorth's spiritual maturity lies in his capacity to hold doubt and faith simultaneously, to acknowledge uncertainty while still acting on conviction. This nuanced portrayal of religious psychology elevates the film above propaganda. The abbey's location in Spain rather than Italy is a deliberate narrative choice that broadens the film's geographic and historical scope. Spain carries specific connotations of the Inquisition, of the violent intersection between church and state, of a Catholicism that was simultaneously glorious and monstrous. By situating the conspiracy in Spanish soil, the film taps into a cultural memory of ecclesiastical violence that an Italian setting might not evoke as strongly. The Spanish setting also distances the action from the Vatican geographically, creating a sense that the Church's problems are not centralized but distributed across its entire historical footprint. Evil has been planted everywhere, and exorcists must become travelers. The film's thematic engagement with fatherhood operates on multiple registers simultaneously. Henry's biological father is dead, leaving a wound that the demon exploits. Amorth functions as a surrogate father to Henry during the exorcism, offering protection that the boy's actual father cannot provide. Father Thomas is a spiritual son to Amorth, receiving formation in a dangerous vocation. Even the demon presents itself as a kind of father, a false patriarch offering power in exchange for submission. The whole film can be read as a contest between good and bad fatherhood, between the father who sacrifices himself for the child and the father who consumes the child for his own purposes. The film's commercial success relative to its modest budget suggests an underserved audience appetite for Catholic-themed action horror. The box office returns indicate that there exists a substantial viewership that does not require theological precision or critical acclaim, only committed performances and a narrative that treats spiritual warfare with sufficient seriousness to justify the spectacle. This audience is often invisible to cultural gatekeepers who assume that religious themes must be handled with either reverent solemnity or ironic distance. The film proves that a middle path exists, one that respects faith enough to take it seriously while also recognizing that exorcism narratives contain inherent entertainment value. The narrative's reliance on the discovery of hidden documents and sealed chambers aligns it with a long tradition of Gothic and archaeological fiction. The pleasure of such narratives lies in the fantasy that buried truths can be unearthed, that architectural investigation can solve historical crimes. The Abbey becomes a text to be read, its stones a manuscript in a forgotten language. Amorth's detective work, decoding symbols and tracing historical connections, positions him as much as an archaeologist as a priest. This fusion of scholarly investigation and spiritual warfare appeals to a modern sensibility that values evidence even in supernatural contexts. The demon's strategic deployment of Amorth's own memories as weapons raises philosophical questions about the nature of guilt and forgiveness. If Amorth has been sacramentally absolved of his failure with Rosaria, why does the memory still have power? The film's implicit answer is that sacramental forgiveness removes eternal guilt, but not psychological consequence. The memory remains as a scar, and scars can be pressed to cause pain. The demon does not need unforgiven sin to attack. It only needs human vulnerability, which persists even in the forgiven. This is a theologically mature insight disguised as horror movie psychology. The film's pacing creates a structural problem that it never fully resolves. The long middle section devoted to conspiracy investigation drains momentum from the possession horror, while the action climax feels rushed because so much time was spent in catacombs. This structural imbalance reflects a fundamental tension in the screenplay between two different films. One is a claustrophobic horror story about a family trapped with a demon. The other is a globe-trotting conspiracy thriller about institutional corruption. The film attempts to be both, and the transition between modes is accomplished through a literal descent into the earth, a narrative spatialization of genre shift. The choice to make the demon physically combative rather than purely psychological distinguishes the film from more prestigious exorcism narratives. In higher-brow treatments, the demon is a presence felt rather than seen, a voice that torments through truth rather than force. This film's Asmodeus throws people across rooms, animates vehicles, and engages in direct physical confrontation. This choice demotes the demon from metaphysical threat to movie monster, which has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is visual spectacle. The disadvantage is that a monster can be fought, while a metaphysical threat requires a more complex response than violence. The depiction of Vatican internal politics, though cartoonish, gestures toward real ecclesiastical tensions that the historical Amorth navigated throughout his career. The film's Vatican is a place where exorcism is tolerated but not encouraged, where Amorth's work is seen as an embarrassment to a church seeking modern credibility. This tension between charismatic spiritual practice and institutional respectability is historically authentic, even if the film's conspiracy narrative is invented. The real Amorth did face skepticism from fellow clergy who considered his ministry medieval and superstitious, and his media profile made him a controversial figure within his own hierarchy. The film's engagement with theodicy, the problem of evil, operates at a popular rather than academic level, but still gestures toward sophisticated answers. Why does God allow possession? The film's implicit answer is that God allows free will, both human and angelic, and does not suspend its consequences even when they produce horror. The demonic is not God's creation, but a corruption of angelic freedom, and human vulnerability to it is a consequence of human freedom exercised badly over centuries. This is standard free will theodicy, but the film makes it visceral rather than abstract by embedding it in a child's suffering body. The visual contrast between the Roman scenes and the Spanish abbey scenes extends to costume and color theory. In Rome, Amorth wears clean cassocks in well-lit offices. In Spain, his vestments become progressively dirtier, torn, stained with blood and dust. This degradation of costume tracks his descent from institutional authority to personal vocation, from a man who represents the church to a man who represents Christ in the arena. The vestments are not merely clothing but a visible register of spiritual condition, and by the climax, Amorth looks like a martyr in the making, stripped of everything but faith. The film's use of humor as a defensive strategy against horror is a technique borrowed from classic adventure cinema. Amorth's one-liners are not merely comic relief. They are theological statements in jest. When he quips that the demon is a pain in the neck, he is performing an act of spiritual defiance, refusing to grant the demon the dignity of fear. This strategy has deep roots in Christian tradition. The risus paschalis, the Easter laugh, the mockery of defeated evil. The film secularizes this tradition, turning it into crowd-pleasing banter, but the underlying principle remains. Laughter is a weapon against powers that demand to be taken seriously. The film's depiction of Henry's post-exorcism recovery is brief, but significant in its implications. He is not instantly healed but exhausted, disoriented, needing time to reintegrate. This brief coda acknowledges that exorcism is not magic but medicine, that liberation from possession begins rather than ends the healing process. The psychological trauma of being used as a demonic vessel will require ongoing care, and the film's quiet acknowledgement of this reality provides a final note of responsibility after the spectacle concludes. The exorcist's job is not complete when the demon departs. The person remains fragile and in need of continued love. The architecture of the sequel tease, showing Amorth on a plane heading to his next mission, transforms the solitary exorcist into the leader of a burgeoning team. Father Thomas is with him, suggesting that the apprentice has been fully initiated. The map of 199 sites implies a structured campaign rather than isolated interventions. This ending completely recontextualizes the preceding narrative as an origin story, a genre shift executed in the final seconds. The effect is jarring but commercially legible, positioning the film as a pilot episode for a series in which two priests travel the world fighting demons and conspiracies. The film's treatment of sacramental confession as both a plot device and a thematic anchor deserves final consideration. The possessed inquisitor's unabsolved confessions, the hidden confessional beneath the abbey, Amorth's own need to confess his failure, and the climactic public confession of the demon's identity all form a network of references to the sacrament. The film suggests, without ever quite stating, that the exorcism crisis exists because confession has failed. Secrets unconfessed become gateways, sins unabsolved become weapons. The solution to demonic possession is not merely ritual expulsion but sacramental honesty, a thorough opening of the soul to grace. This is the film's most genuinely Catholic insight, and it survives the action movie trappings largely intact. The relationship between folklore and institutional religion forms a subterranean current throughout the narrative, surfacing in the choice to set the action in rural Spain rather than metropolitan Rome. Spanish Catholicism has always existed in intimate proximity to pre-Christian traditions, folk beliefs about spirits, curses, and haunted places that the official church alternately absorbed, suppressed, or pretended did not exist. The abbey stands at the intersection of these two streams. Above ground, the sanctioned liturgy; below ground, something older and less manageable. The film suggests, perhaps unintentionally, that the demonic flourishes in the gap between popular piety and clerical rationalism, in the space where people continue to believe things the institution has decided are embarrassing. The casting of Franco Nero as the Pope constitutes a piece of intertextual shorthand that rewards cinephile recognition. Nero's face carries decades of cinematic history, from the spaghetti western antihero to the art house radical, and his presence as the pontiff imports a gravitas that a less familiar actor could not provide. His brief scenes with Crowe crackle with unspoken history, two veterans of Italian-set cinema meeting as characters whose institutional relationship barely contains their mutual respect. The Pope's silent reaction to the map of possessed sites is a masterclass in minimalist acting. Nero communicates shock, shame, and steely resolve through posture alone, preparing the audience for the sequel without a word of explicit setup. The film's engagement with the problem of psychiatric reductionism is more nuanced than its sensational surface suggests. The historical Amorth was often criticized for dismissing mental illness as demonic, and the film addresses this by making his failure with Rosaria precisely this error. His arc does not lead him to reject psychology, but to recognize its limits, to understand that some phenomena exceed the diagnostic framework without negating its genuine achievements. This is a surprisingly balanced position for a film of this genre, acknowledging that the supernatural and the psychological are not enemies but overlapping territories, and that wisdom consists in knowing which map applies to which terrain. The economic subtext of the abbey's ownership by an American widow deserves consideration as a quiet commentary on the secularization of Europe's sacred spaces. Across the continent, ancient churches and monasteries are sold to private buyers who convert them into homes, hotels, or event spaces, stripping them of consecration through market exchange. Julia inherits a sacred site she does not understand, filled with dangers she cannot imagine, because the church either forgot about it or chose to divest. This quiet economic detail frames the horror as partly a consequence of the commodification of the holy. When sacred space becomes real estate, the safeguards lift. The demon's tactic of speaking through a child's voice while modulating it with adult malice draws on a specific horror tradition that understands vocal incongruity as a primal trigger for unease. The human brain is wired to find certain mismatches deeply wrong, and a child's mouth producing a grown man's threats exploits this cognitive vulnerability with surgical precision. The sound design layers the boy actor's actual voice with lower registers and subtle distortions that never fully obscure the child underneath, creating an effect of violation that is more intimate than graphic violence. The demon is not destroying the child, it is wearing him, and the audience can hear the child still present, trapped beneath the invader. The visual presentation of sacred objects throughout the film follows a consistent logic that deserves analysis. Crucifixes, holy water, relics, and vestments are never shown as inherently magical. Their power is entirely relational, dependent on the faith of the user and the authority of the church they represent. When Father Thomas attempts to use them while gripped by fear, they are ineffectual. When Amorth uses the same objects with calm authority, they burn. This distinction is theologically precise and dramatically effective, externalizing the internal state of the characters through their interaction with matter. The sacramental principle that grace works through physical things is maintained, but the film adds the crucial caveat that the disposition of the minister matters enormously. The character of Julia, the grieving widow and mother, is written with less complexity than her situation warrants, but Alex Esso's performance compensates for the underwritten role. Esso communicates through posture and gaze what the dialogue does not provide. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has lost her husband and is now losing her son to something she cannot comprehend. Her skepticism is not ideological but practical, the resistance of someone who has already suffered more than she can process and refuses to accept another impossible burden. When she finally witnesses undeniable evidence of possession, her conversion is not triumphant but devastating. Another certainty stripped away from a life already depleted of comfort. The film's Prohibition-era gangster undertones in its portrayal of Vatican politics merit attention. The curial officials who monitor Amorth speak in the coded language of institutional risk management, more concerned with exposure and liability than with souls. Their function in the narrative is to represent the Church as corporation, an entity whose primary duty is self-preservation. Amorth's maverick status, his direct line to the Pope that bypasses normal channels, makes him dangerous to this system. The film frames institutional caution not as prudence but as complicity, a quiet argument that bureaucracies are structurally incapable of confronting evil because evil does not file the proper paperwork. The theological implications of the demon's claim to know church secrets extend beyond the immediate plot into deeper questions about the nature of the demonic. If Asmodeus knows what the Vatican has hidden, then the demon has access to reality that the Church denies. This inverts the traditional hierarchy of knowledge, where the Church possesses revealed truth and demons are liars. Here, the demon becomes the revealer and the Church the concealer, a genuinely subversive narrative choice for a film that otherwise embraces Catholic piety. The audience is left uncertain whether to trust the demon's accusations, a state of epistemological ambiguity that mirrors the crisis of clerical abuse scandals in the real world. The film's approach to the corporeality of evil contrasts usefully with the tendency in some religious horror to spiritualize evil into abstraction. Here, evil is physical, leaving bruises, breaking bones, requiring physical force to expel. This insistence on the body as the site of spiritual conflict is deeply incarnational, even if the theological implications are not fully explored. The demon wants a body because a body is required to act in the material world. The exorcist must use his body to cast it out. The entire drama is somatic, a clash of physical presences in physical space, and this concreteness protects the film from dissolving into ethereal vagueness about spiritual struggle. The relationship between text and image in the film's use of Latin ritual is worth analyzing. The viewers are not given subtitles for the exorcism prayers, which means the words function as music rather than information. This choice preserves the mystery of the rite and prevents the audience from judging its efficacy based on verbal content. The power of the prayer is located in its performance, in Crowe's delivery, not in its translatable meaning. This parallels the Catholic experience of the Tridentan Mass, where the faithful often did not understand the Latin but participated through presence and posture. The film recreates this pre-modern relationship to sacred language, trusting the sound to carry spiritual weight. The demon's eventual defeat through love rather than force marks the film's most significant departure from the action movie template it otherwise embraces. Amorth wins not because he is stronger or more clever or better equipped, but because he is willing to be damned for another. This is a profoundly Christological resolution smuggled into a product designed for multiplex consumption. The audience expecting a final boss battle gets instead a sacrificial offering. Whether this lands emotionally depends entirely on Crowe's ability to sell the moment. And he does, finding in Amorth's worn features a capacity for love that the preceding action sequences have only hinted at. The spatial politics of the exorcism chamber are carefully managed throughout the film. The possessed Henry is always positioned at the center, making him the focus of every frame, while Amorth and Thomas circle him like planets around a dark sun. This centering of the possessed emphasizes their status as victim rather than monster, a visual argument that the person beneath the demon remains the subject of the drama. The demon may speak from the center, but the exorcists orient themselves toward the center, their attention a form of love that refuses to abandon the afflicted to the afflictor. The staging is an act of solidarity made visible. The film's relationship to its Italian horror heritage is evident in its use of color, particularly the saturated reds that appear during moments of supernatural intensity. This chromatic reference to the films of Dario Argento and Mario Bava situates the production within a national tradition of Catholic horror that understands vivid color as a vehicle for spiritual extremity. The red is not merely blood. It is the visual frequency of damnation and passion, of martyrdom and sin. By employing this palette, the film claims descent from a lineage of Italian genre filmmaking that has long understood Catholicism as a natural habitat for horror. The bureaucracy of exorcism, glimpsed in the Vatican scenes where Amorth must justify his work to committees, provides a satirical edge to the otherwise earnest narrative. The idea that casting out demons requires administrative approval is inherently absurd, and the film mines this absurdity for quiet laughs that do not undermine the central drama. The officials who worry about protocol and precedent are not villains. They are functionaries whose job is to manage institutional risk. The demonic does not fit their forms. Amorth's impatience with this system is one of his most sympathetic traits, aligning him with the audience's instinct that some things should bypass committee review. The liminal status of the abbey as both consecrated ground and site of atrocity creates a spatial paradox that the film exploits for maximum unease. A church is supposed to be safe, a sanctuary from evil, but this church was built atop a torture chamber, and the consecration above did not purify the corruption below. The resulting hybrid space is neither fully sacred nor fully profane, a threshold where the normal rules do not apply. Liminality is classically associated with spiritual danger. Crossroads, thresholds, and boundaries are places where the demonic can cross. The abbey is one vast threshold, and the family lives suspended between heaven and hell. The film's modest budget manifests not only in its inconsistent CGI, but also in its reliance on a limited number of locations, a constraint that becomes a creative strength. The claustrophobia of the single-setting horror film is preserved for much of the runtime, generating tension through confinement. The characters cannot leave. The audience cannot leave. The demon controls the exits. This spatial pressure cooker would be diluted by a larger budget that permitted more locations and more spectacle. Scarcity of resources concentrates attention on performance and atmosphere, and the film's best moments emerge from this concentration. The depiction of the demonic as organized, networked, and strategic runs counter to the popular image of demons as chaotic agents of destruction. Asmodeus speaks of plans that span centuries, of an intelligence that coordinates attacks across continents. This portrayal aligns with traditional demonology, which understands fallen angels as retaining their angelic intellect and organizational capacity, even in rebellion. The film's demons are not mindless beasts but generals in a war, and the 199 sites are not random outbreaks but a coordinated deployment. This raises the stakes from personal to cosmic without needing to show armies. The film's treatment of the Pope as a figure who knows less than his own exorcist is a gentle satire of hierarchical ignorance. The pontiff is holy, well-meaning, and completely out of the loop, reliant on Amorth to tell him what his own institution has been hiding. This inversion of the expected flow of knowledge from top to bottom suggests that the real work of the church happens at the margins, among those who actually confront evil rather than those who manage it from offices. The Pope's humility in receiving this truth is portrayed as a sign of his holiness, but the situation itself is an indictment of the system he leads. The visual motif of doors and thresholds recurs throughout the film, creating a symbolic vocabulary of access and obstruction. The demon can only enter where a door has been opened, whether by deliberate invitation or by unhealed trauma. The job of the exorcist is to close doors, to seal thresholds, to restore boundaries that sin has breached. This spatial theology is communicated through careful framing. Amorth is often shown standing in doorways, occupying the threshold between the possessed and the world, his body a living barrier that evil must pass through to reach its prey. The film's final moments, before the sequel tease, offer a rare cinematic image of clerical friendship. Amorth and Father Thomas, having survived the ordeal together, share a moment of exhausted solidarity that is neither sentimental nor triumphalist. They are simply two men who have seen the same horror and are still standing. This quiet depiction of vocational companionship is perhaps the film's most unexpected gift, a reminder that the exorcist's life is not only combat but community, that the fight against darkness is sustained by bonds between those who fight it together. The presence of a possessed animal, the pig that Amorth shoots without hesitation, introduces an element of creation theology that the film does not fully develop but which merits attention. Animals in Christian thought are part of the created order affected by human sin, but not personally guilty. The possessed pig is a victim, and its death is a mercy, a release from a condition it did not choose. Amorth's willingness to end its suffering immediately, without the extended ritual reserved for the human possessed, suggests a hierarchy of concern that values the immortal human soul above the mortal animal body, a position consistent with traditional theology but uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. The technical achievement of the film's sound mixing deserves specific mention for its role in creating spatial disorientation during possession scenes. The demon's voice does not come from a fixed point but moves around the sound field, sometimes from the possessed child, sometimes from the walls, sometimes from directly behind the listener. This mixing technique, borrowed from psychological horror, places the audience inside the experience of the characters, unable to locate the source of the threat. The disorientation is not merely a special effect but a phenomenological argument. The demonic is not locatable in physical space because it is fundamentally a spiritual reality. The film's quiet argument that exorcism is a normal, if extreme, aspect of the Church's pastoral ministry rather than a spectacular anomaly is one of its more grounded theological commitments. Amorth's office in Rome is cluttered with files, his calendar is full, his work is routine in its abnormality. This portrayal demythologizes exorcism without desacralizing it, making it seem less like a horror movie event and more like a specialized form of spiritual care. The real Amorth's ministry was precisely this, a daily practice of liberation that he approached with the professionalism of a surgeon and the faith of a mystic. The tension between Amorth's public persona and his private pain is one of the film's most effective character dynamics. In public, he is confident, witty, unflappable. In private, especially in the scenes where the demon forces him to confront Rosaria, he is a man still bleeding from an old wound. This division is not hypocrisy but vocation. The exorcist cannot afford to bring his unresolved guilt into the ritual, so he compartmentalizes until the compartment breaks open. Crowe navigates this shift with subtle physical adjustments, a slackening of the shoulders, a sudden aging of the face, that communicate interior collapse without melodrama. The film's ultimate legacy may be as a transitional object in the evolution of faith-based entertainment, a work that bridges the gap between the solemn piety of traditional religious cinema and the kinetic energy of the modern blockbuster. It is neither wholly one nor the other, and its mixed reception reflects the discomfort of audiences and critics with a hybrid they did not know they wanted. Whether sequels materialize or not, the template it establishes, the warrior priest as franchise hero, will likely prove influential for future attempts to make religious commitment look like fun rather than obligation. The film does not ask to be taken seriously. It asks to be enjoyed seriously, and that is a different request. The archaeological dimension of the narrative deserves deeper excavation, as the film positions Amorth not merely as a priest, but as an investigator of buried crimes whose tools are both liturgical and forensic. His descent into the catacombs mirrors the work of a historical researcher, brushing dust from forgotten inscriptions, piecing together fragmentary evidence into a coherent account of institutional malfeasance. This fusion of the scholarly and the spiritual is rarely depicted in religious cinema, which tends to separate the intellectual life from the charismatic gift. The film proposes that exorcism requires both, that the demonic hides in historical complexity as much as in individual souls, and that casting it out demands understanding how it got in. The film's treatment of silence as a sonic weapon marks a sophisticated understanding of horror's auditory palette. The moments between the demon's taunts, the pauses before Amorth's responses, the sudden absence of ambient sound when the supernatural manifests, all create a rhythm of tension and release that manipulates the audience's nervous system with precision. Silence in this context is not empty but pregnant, a held breath before the strike. The demon uses silence to make the next sound more terrifying. Amorth uses silence to refuse the demon the engagement it craves. Their battle unfolds as much in what is not said as in what is spoken. The relationship between Amorth and his Vespa, treated with almost fetishistic attention in the early scenes, functions as a symbol of his liminal status within the church. The scooter is not an official vehicle. It is personal transport, agile where the institutional church is lumbering, quick where bureaucracy is slow. It allows him to move through Roman traffic, through the crowded streets of the faithful, at a speed that official channels cannot match. The Vespa is his independence made visible, a small rebellion against the expectation that a Vatican official should travel in a black car with diplomatic plates. It is also, not incidentally, charming, and charm is part of his arsenal. The demon's mastery of mimicry extends beyond voice into the realm of effective manipulation, as it performs concern, empathy, and even affection in order to destabilize its victims. These performances are not convincing as genuine emotion, but as mockery of genuine emotion, a cruel parody of the care that the possessed person actually needs. The demon mimics love the way a predator mimics the mating call of its prey, and the horror lies in the gap between the form of care and its complete absence. This is a more subtle form of violation than physical violence, an assault on the very category of compassion. The film's economic geography, moving from the wealth and power of Rome to the poverty and isolation of rural Spain, maps spiritual decline onto material conditions. The abbey, once presumably a center of monastic life and local economy, is now a ruin being renovated by foreign capital, its sacred purpose forgotten by a secularized Europe. The demonic resurgence occurs in a place that has been abandoned by the church as much as by the economy, a double desertion that leaves the land vulnerable. There is a muted social critique here, a suggestion that the church's withdrawal from rural communities has spiritual consequences it has not accounted for. The confessional booth discovered beneath the abbey is not merely a plot device, but a theological provocation. Sealed for centuries, it contains the unabsolved sins of a possessed priest who used the sacrament as a weapon. The booth itself becomes a symbol of inversion, a place of mercy transformed into a place of accumulation, where sins were deposited but never lifted. Amorth's act of opening it is an act of theological correction, a delayed absolution that releases what was trapped. The scene operates as a dark sacrament in reverse, an anti-confession that restores the possibility of real confession. The physical toll on Crowe's body throughout the production is visible on screen in ways that CGI cannot replicate. The actor was in his late 50s during filming, and his exhaustion in the final act reads as genuine, a man pushing a body past its limits for a cause. This physical authenticity grounds the supernatural action in corporeal reality, reminding the audience that priests are not superheroes but aging men with aching joints and limited stamina. The demon does not need to kill Amorth. It needs only to exhaust him, and the film's willingness to show that exhaustion makes the eventual victory feel earned rather than scripted. The theological concept of the communion of saints hovers at the edges of the film's climax, invoked visually through the Marian apparition and implicitly through the network of prayer that Amorth represents. He is not fighting alone. He carries the prayers of the faithful, the authority of the Pope, the intercession of the Virgin, and the historical witness of every exorcist who came before. This invisible community is made briefly visible in the light that defeats the demon, a visual shorthand for a complex doctrine that the individual believer is never isolated, but always embedded in a living body of intercessory relationship. The film's handling of adolescent sexuality in the character of Amy is notably restrained, avoiding the exploitative trajectory that lesser horror films might pursue. The demon threatens her but does not sexualize her possession, a choice that respects both the character and the audience. Her vulnerability is emotional rather than carnal, rooted in her grief for her father and her fear for her brother. This restraint is theologically consistent. The demon attacks the whole person, not merely the body, and the most effective assaults target the soul's attachments rather than the body's boundaries. The bureaucracy of miracle verification that exists in the real Vatican provides an ironic counterpoint to the film's conspiracy narrative. In reality, the Church moves slowly to authenticate supernatural claims, employing skeptics and scientists to rule out natural explanations before declaring something miraculous. The film inverts this careful process into its opposite, a conspiracy of concealment that moves with bureaucratic deliberation to hide rather than reveal. The audience familiar with real Vatican procedure will recognize the parody, while those unfamiliar may absorb a distorted picture of ecclesiastical caution as conspiracy. The demon's strategic patience, waiting centuries between major manifestations, reflects a temporal perspective that exceeds human lifespans. Asmodeus does not operate on human time. It can afford to wait for conditions to align, for the right vulnerable person to arrive at the right haunted place. This long-term view is one of the demon's most terrifying attributes, because it means the current attack is not an isolated event, but the culmination of a plan set in motion before any of the human characters were born. The exorcist must respond in urgent human time to a threat conceived in geological time. The representation of the Eucharist in the film is minimal, but significant in its minimalism. Unlike some exorcism films that center the host as the primary weapon, this film distributes sacred power across multiple objects: the rosary, the cross, the breviary, the confessional, the intercession of Mary. This distribution of the sacred reflects a Catholic sensibility that understands grace as mediated through many channels rather than concentrated in one. The Eucharist is not absent but integrated into a sacramental ecosystem where multiple holy things cooperate in the work of liberation. The film's color grading during the exorcism sequences shifts toward a desaturated, almost monochromatic palette that evokes archival footage or faded photographs, a visual suggestion that the current possession is connected to the historical events depicted in flashback. This chromatic continuity between past and present reinforces the narrative's central claim that the sins of the Inquisition are not finished but ongoing, that the demon expelled today is the same demon that corrupted a priest centuries ago. Color becomes a temporal bridge, linking eras through a shared visual language of decay. The figure of the skeptical local priest who initially calls for Amorth's help enacts a miniature drama of clerical education. He begins as a rationalist, embarrassed by the pre-modern implications of his own request, but is gradually educated by witnessing what his training denied. His arc is the arc the film hopes for in its audience, a movement from ironic distance to engaged belief, from theoretical knowledge of evil to experiential encounter. He is the stand-in for the modern viewer who knows possession only as a movie trope and must be persuaded that the film takes it seriously. The film's treatment of water as a multivalent symbol draws on the deep reservoirs of baptismal theology. Holy water is used not merely as a weapon but as a reminder, a material recollection of the baptism that marked the possessed person as God's property. The demon's violent reaction to holy water is not a chemical response but a theological one. It hates the water because the water speaks of a claim that precedes and overrides its own. Every splash is a reassertion of baptismal identity, a declaration that the possessed belongs to Christ regardless of current appearances. The architecture of the sequel setup deserves comparison to the Marvel Cinematic Universe model of post-credits world-building. The map of 199 sites, the team dynamic with Father Thomas, the airplane departure, all replicate the grammar of franchise construction that audiences now recognize instinctively. The difference lies in the content. Instead of superheroes and infinity stones, the franchise offers sacraments and exorcisms, holy relics and demonic strongholds. The form is borrowed from secular entertainment, but the substance is drawn from 2 millennia of Catholic spiritual warfare tradition. The performance of the demon through Henry's body requires the young actor to embody a consciousness that is not his own while still suggesting the trapped child underneath. This dual performance is the technical heart of any exorcism film, and D'Souza Fayani achieves it through precise control of his eyes, which shift between childlike terror and ancient malice within single shots. The eyes are the window that the demon cannot fully close, and the film's close-ups on Henry's face during moments of internal struggle communicate the war being fought for his soul more effectively than any special effect. The film's release during the Easter season of 2023 was a deliberate marketing choice that positioned it as counter-programming to secular blockbusters while leveraging the cultural association between spring and resurrection. The release date implicitly promised that the horror would lead to hope, that the possession would end in liberation, that the tomb of the abbey would ultimately be empty. Whether audiences consciously registered this liturgical framing is less important than the way it shaped the film's reception as a fundamentally optimistic horror experience. The demon's claim to know the location of hidden church wealth, made in a passing taunt, gestures toward the real historical controversies over the Vatican Bank and the financial scandals that have periodically rocked the institution. The film does not pursue this thread, but its inclusion suggests a demonology of institutional corruption in which spiritual evil and financial malfeasance are connected rather than coincidental. The demon is not only interested in souls, It is interested in the structures of power that shape human life, and money is one of those structures. The theological distinction between obsession, oppression, and possession, well known in Catholic demonology but obscure to most audiences, is collapsed by the film into a single spectacular manifestation for dramatic purposes. This compression loses nuance but gains clarity. The average viewer does not need to understand the gradations of demonic influence to follow the story. The film chooses accessibility over precision, a defensible artistic choice that nonetheless flattens the rich taxonomy of spiritual affliction that the real Amorth's writings explore in detail. The film's atmosphere during its strongest moments achieves a quality of sacred dread that is distinct from secular horror. The fear is not merely of death or pain but of damnation, of being separated from love forever. This dread is specific to religious horror at its best, and the film accesses it sporadically, usually when Crowe is allowed to be still and the script stops explaining and starts evoking. These moments, scattered throughout the action, suggest a better, quieter film buried beneath the spectacle. The relationship between prayer and action in the film resolves into a synthesis rather than a dichotomy. Amorth prays while fighting, fights while praying, and the two activities become indistinguishable at the climax. This integration of contemplation and action reflects a mature spirituality that understands the false choice between activism and interiority. The Exorcist must be both a mystic and a soldier, and the film's action sequences are, at their best, prayers in motion. The film's final image before the credits, Amorth on the plane with his files and his rosary, is a quiet portrait of vocational exhaustion that lingers longer than the noisy climax. He is not celebrating. He is traveling to the next crisis, a man whose work is never finished because evil is never fully defeated in this life. This eschatological realism, the recognition that spiritual warfare is ongoing rather than conclusive, is the most honest note the film strikes. The war continues, and the warrior priest continues with it, armed with nothing but faith and the knowledge that he has been forgiven enough to forgive himself. The film's engagement with the architectural uncanny deserves sustained attention, as the abbey operates according to a spatial logic that is deliberately wrong. Corridors seem longer than the exterior dimensions permit, staircases descend further than the foundation should allow, and rooms appear where no room should be. This spatial distortion is not explicitly supernatural in presentation, but subtly wrong, a quiet violation of physical expectation that primes the audience for larger violations. The abbey is not haunted by a ghost, but by a geometry that has become complicit with the demonic, walls that lean in to listen, floors that slope toward darkness. The decision to make Amorth a veteran of the Italian resistance during World War II, mentioned in passing dialogue, adds historical depth to his character without romanticizing it. He has seen organized evil before, has fought it with guns and bombs before fighting it with prayers and sacramentals. This biographical detail explains his lack of romanticism about the demonic. He recognizes in Asmodeus the same will to domination he saw in fascism, a continuity of evil across its secular and sacred manifestations. The war never ended for him, it only changed weapons. The film's treatment of exorcism as a medical procedure requiring diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up care is a subtle normalization strategy. Amorth examines the possessed with the attention of a clinician, asking questions, tracking symptoms, adjusting his approach based on the demon's responses. This medical framing demystifies exorcism without desacralizing it, presenting it as a skilled practice rather than a miraculous intervention. The real Amorth often compared exorcists to doctors, and the film preserves this analogy as a bridge for skeptical viewers who might accept a medical metaphor more readily than a supernatural one. The demon's use of Latin during the exorcism constitutes a deliberate mockery of the Church's sacred language. When Asmodeus speaks Latin, it is not to obey but to parody, to demonstrate that the language of the rite is not inherently holy, but merely instrumental, available for abuse like any other human invention. This linguistic theft is a form of desecration, an assault on the words themselves, and Amorth's response is not to abandon Latin, but to speak it with greater authority, reasserting the language's proper orientation toward God through the sheer force of his intention. The brief appearance of the fully manifested demon, a creature of spikes and shadow, is the film's most significant visual miscalculation. The monster is less frightening than the possessed child because it is recognizable as a special effect, a digital construct that belongs to a different visual register than the practical body horror that precedes it. The design is not incompetent, but it breaks the carefully constructed atmosphere of intimate violation and replaces it with generic spectacle. The true demon, the film has already demonstrated, is more terrifying when it wears a human face. The subplot concerning the Abbey's renovation by foreign capital merits analysis as a quiet critique of heritage commodification. Julia and her children are not pilgrims or parishioners. They are owners, possessors of a deed that gives them legal, but not spiritual title to the sacred site. The renovation they undertake is cosmetic, concerned with surfaces rather than foundations, and they remain blind to the deeper architecture of evil beneath their feet. The film suggests that sacred spaces cannot be owned by those who do not understand them, and that the pretense of ownership leaves one vulnerable to the space's true residents. The dynamic between Amorth and the demon during the climactic negotiation scene operates as a perverse form of spiritual direction, with the demon offering Amorth a false path to peace through despair. The demon's argument is seductive because it contains partial truth. The church is corrupt, Amorth has failed, Rosaria is dead, and none of this can be undone. The demon presents these facts as conclusive evidence that faith is futile, and Amorth's victory consists in accepting the facts while rejecting their interpretation. This is spiritual discernment under maximum pressure, the capacity to distinguish between factual truth and diabolical framing. The film's marketing campaign, which leaned heavily on Crowe's image against a crimson background with the tagline, "The Vatican's Best-Kept Secret," positioned the film as an ecclesiastical thriller rather than a possession horror. This marketing choice shaped audience expectations in ways that the film both fulfilled and frustrated. The thriller elements are present, but the horror is more graphic than the campaign suggested, and the action is more pronounced. The gap between marketing and product is a familiar feature of genre cinema, but it explains some of the critical dismissal from reviewers who felt misled. The theological problem of demonic knowledge, the question of what demons can and cannot know, is touched upon but not resolved by the narrative. Asmodeus knows Amorth's past, knows the church's secrets, knows the locations of the other possessed sites. But the film never clarifies whether this knowledge is acquired through observation over centuries or through some supernatural access to hidden truth. The ambiguity is productive, leaving open the unsettling possibility that the demonic has infiltrated the church's information systems as well as its buildings. The film's soundscape during the quieter scenes of investigation employs a technique of near-subliminal dread, frequencies that hover at the edge of audibility, creating physiological unease without conscious recognition. This technique, borrowed from psychological horror, bypasses the analytical brain and speaks directly to the nervous system. The audience feels the demonic presence before seeing it, a somatic knowledge that mirrors the intuitive discernment Amorth practices as an exorcist. The body knows evil before the mind can name it. The portrayal of childhood innocence as both a shield and a target represents one of the film's more uncomfortable theological truths. Henry's innocence does not protect him. It makes him attractive to the demon, a vessel whose purity will be most satisfying to corrupt. This is a darkened version of the Christian understanding that the pure in heart shall see God. Here, the pure in heart attracts the devil, and the film does not flinch from the cruelty of this dynamic. The protection of children is shown to be not a natural state, but a constant vigilance, and the failure of adults to provide that vigilance is the demon's opportunity. The institutional amnesia of the church regarding its own history of abuse and cover-up is the film's most pointed contemporary critique, even if it is delivered through the safe distance of the Inquisition. When Amorth discovers that the Vatican has known about the 199 sites for centuries, he is discovering what abuse victims and investigative journalists have uncovered in the real church. That the institution has often chosen secrecy over justice, reputation over truth. The film does not belabor this parallel, but it is unmistakable for any viewer familiar with recent church history. The cinematography during the exorcism sequences employs handheld camera work that shifts between Amorth's steady presence and the chaotic movement around him. This contrast in visual stability communicates the exorcist's function as a still point in a turning world, a fixed reference against which the demon's chaos can be measured. The camera calms when Crowe speaks the prayers, steadies when he takes command, and the audience's own disorientation is resolved through this visual anchor. Technique becomes theology. The film's use of the natural world as a register of supernatural disturbance follows a long tradition in Gothic fiction. Animals behave strangely before the demon manifests. The wind rises without meteorological cause. the light fails earlier than the hour demands. These environmental cues are conventional but effective, grounding the supernatural in the observable world and suggesting that possession is not merely a psychological event, but a cosmic disturbance that ripples outward from the possessed body into the created order. The relationship between Amorth and the local bishop, who appears briefly to authorize the exorcism and then retreats to safety, illustrates the gap between institutional authority and charismatic power. The bishop has the formal authority to permit or forbid the rite, but he lacks the spiritual power to perform it. Amorth has the power but requires the permission. This delicate dance between charism and office is a perennial tension in Catholic ecclesiology, and the film dramatizes it without resolving it, leaving both the bishop's caution and Amorth's boldness as partially valid responses to a crisis that exceeds normal categories. The demon's ultimate goal, as revealed in its final speech before expulsion, is not merely to possess one child, but to destroy faith in the Church itself by exposing its hypocrisy. The possession is a trap for Amorth specifically, a lure designed to draw him into the conspiracy and then crush him with the revelation that the institution he serves is complicit in evil. This is strategic demonology, a campaign aimed not at individual souls, but at the credibility of the entire salvific structure. The demon wants Amorth to stop believing in the Church, and through him, to discourage all who might follow his example. The film's brief depiction of Amorth's private prayer life, a single scene of him kneeling alone in a Roman church before departing for Spain, provides the spiritual foundation that the action sequences rest upon. Without this moment of quiet devotion, the subsequent heroics would feel unmoored from their theological source. With it, the audience understands that Amorth's power is not his own but drawn from a relationship maintained in solitude and silence. The scene is short but load-bearing, and its placement just before the journey to Spain is structurally essential. The casting of relatively unknown actors in the supporting roles, particularly the Spanish locals and the Vatican officials, creates a documentary texture around Crowe's star performance. These faces feel like faces one might encounter in a real village or a real curial office, not Hollywood extras playing types. This casting strategy grounds the fantastical elements in a baseline of realism, making the supernatural eruptions more startling by contrast with the ordinary world they disrupt. The film's treatment of exorcism as a juridical act, a legal proceeding in the court of heaven with the demon as defendant and the possessed as contested property, is a theologically precise but rarely depicted aspect of the rite. Amorth functions as an advocate, pleading the case for the possessed person's liberation before the divine tribunal, and the demon functions as an adversary arguing for continued possession based on some legal claim, some door left open. This juridical framing is present in the actual rite of exorcism, but is almost never communicated in popular cinema, which prefers the more cinematic model of spiritual combat. The economics of exorcism, the fact that Amorth's ministry is funded by the institutional church even as that institution disapproves of his methods, creates an ironic tension that the film acknowledges without exploring. He is a tolerated dissident, a necessary embarrassment, and his position is secure only so long as he produces results without causing scandal. This precarious institutional location explains his careful navigation of Vatican politics, his ability to speak truth to power without forcing power to respond. The demon's mockery of Amorth's physical appearance, his weight, his age, his accent, reveals the pettiness that coexists with cosmic malevolence. Evil is not only grand and tragic, it is also mean small, preoccupied with the vulnerabilities of aging bodies and human vanity. This pettiness is realistic, a reminder that the demonic is not elevated but debased, not sophisticated but cruel in the manner of a schoolyard bully with infinite power. The grandeur of evil is a romantic illusion. The reality, the film suggests, is nastiness amplified to supernatural volume. The film's final act restoration of Henry to his family is handled with a restraint that honors the gravity of what he has endured. There is no instant embrace, no swelling music, no easy return to normalcy. The family sits together in exhausted silence, survivors of an ordeal whose consequences will unfold for years. This restraint is emotionally honest in a way that a more triumphant resolution would not be. The exorcism is successful, but success does not mean happiness. It means the possibility of healing, which is a different and more difficult thing. The theological virtue of hope, as distinct from optimism, is the note on which the film chooses to end. Amorth on the Plain is not optimistic. He knows there are 199 more sights, 199 more battles, 199 more chances to fail as he failed Rosaria. But he is hopeful in the technical theological sense. He trusts that the outcome is in God's hands, not his, and that his task is simply to show up and offer what he has. This hope is the film's final theological statement, and it is delivered not through dialogue, but through Crowe's weary face, looking out the airplane window at a darkness that does not frighten him anymore.